first trip to Princeton is easy for me to remember because I was on my honeymoon. It was May of 1947, and we had driven down the East Coast and stayed over at the Princeton Inn, which at that time was a very handsome hostelry, and we went to visit the new colleagues of ours at the Office of Population Research. The office was then located at 20 Nassau, an office building, and as I recall, the office was located on the second and fifth floors. I remember in the upper apartment, so to speak, were Wilbert Moore and Kingsley Davis. At that time, only names to me. They had recently come to Princeton from Penn State, and of course eventually became extremely important American sociologists. But at the time, they had been hired by Frank Notstein to write a couple of books on population. I was a young economist with a little bit of mathematics, and was offered a fellowship called the Milbank Memorial Fund Fellowship, and held that for the years 1947 to 50. That was for a long time the only financial support available to a student. Now there were several other students here at the time. I can remember particularly George Stonitz and George Barclay and George Mayer, all of them very close to me, and also Harvey Leibenstein, who took a population course first out of curiosity, and then it became, bit by bit, his life's work. What I remember about the Office of Population Research at that time is connected with the extraordinary group of wonderful people who were associated with the office. One I recall with special fondness is Louise Kaiser. Louise at that time was the heart and soul of the production of the Population Index. Now, Irene Teuber also worked on the index, but her work was somewhere else. It was in Washington at the Library of Congress.
The index was first published in 1935 under the name of Population Literature, and it was published for 2 years under that name, and then was changed to Population Index. I remember some people better than others. I can remember Daphne Notstein was there, and she worked on Population Index, doing some of the graphs, charts and graphs, and she also did paste up and correcting of errors on the mechanicals. There was Irene Teuber, Frank Lorimer, and Frank Notstein. I think they all served in different combinations as editors of Population Index.
And is it true that the young Ansley Cole was a proofreader for the index?
So he tells me, but that was before my time.
Louise Kaiser was the working center of the index, and one of my tasks as a Milbank Fellow was to help proofread on the index. Now, since the index is a multilingual index, what that means when you proofread is that you have to spell every blessed word and all of the funny accents. Louise took pity on me and went to Frank Notstein and said, "This is no way for a young graduate student to use up his time. Couldn't we find anything else for him to do?" And Frank got the notion that perhaps I could do the calculating of the numbers that appear in the back of the index. I was a bit of a mulish person then, perhaps still am, and I decided that before I calculated these numbers, I wanted to know whether they were any good. And so I did an investigation of the measures, in particular of the net reproduction rate. I decided it was a can of worms, and wrote an article about it that appeared in Population Index in conjunction with George Stallman's. It was kind of an exciting thing, not only the first article, but an article that also managed to attract a bit of attention. So what I did with the assignment of calculating the numbers was recommend strongly that the numbers that were hard to calculate shouldn't be calculated. And that ended my particular stint on a population index.
When I first came to the office, as I mentioned before, Dorothy Good was editor of the index. And she was replaced in 1971, I believe, by Barbara Glushevich. And Barbara was later replaced by Richard Hankinson in 1975. And Richard is still here now as editor of Population Index. The biggest change that comes to mind, of course, is the fact that we're computerized now. We supply our data tape to Popline and Hopkins, and they in turn put it into the Popline database so that people all over the world that have access to Popline can search it and look for material.
After we had been at 20 Nassau for a while, we were able to find housing for the office on campus. It was in fact in the old library, which had just recently been replaced by the big Hanson new Firestone Library. And we had very good space in an extremely old building. I can remember the office where I was located. It was a large square room, and in the four corners of the square were George Barclay, Harvey Leibenstein, and Ted Smith, known to one and all as Singapore Smith, because he was doing a book on Singapore. And I was in the fourth corner. I have a picture of the Office of Population Research when it was in the old Pine. The picture consists of the sign that signified it was the OPR, and underneath it is a baby carriage with our first baby in it. One of the other graduate students at the time I was studying here was George Mayer. Although George didn't get into the publishing game, he had a very successful career in teaching and administration at Smith College. And I'm very sorry to say that he died a few years ago. George and I shared an office in the Office of Population Research, and he was, as we all were, impoverished graduate students. He had married, but had no children. There was a very good reason why he had no children. He couldn't afford it. And he was uncertain about whether he was going to have employment for the forthcoming year. I was in the office with him one day when he got a phone call from the economics department saying that he was hired as an instructor for the next year. I can tell you this as absolutely true. He put down the telephone from talking to the secretary of the economics department, picked it up and dialed home, and he said to his wife, Jean, "I'm coming home." They conceived their first child that afternoon. That's applied demography.